I do try to play golf 5 times a week. Okay. Thanks very much for that introduction. It was really well read and written. Okay. So, yes, the bottom line of what I'm going to say today is that animal welfare science thinking and related movement in thinking in many sectors in society has been evolving for quite a few years and is continuing to evolve, and will give a framework for redoubled efforts on behalf of the industry that we're here to discuss today. And we have been here for some time. I'd also like to thank the hosts who've invited me to be here, and for the tremendous hospitality I've experienced while I've been here. Right, good. So, yes, I mean, basically the title there is Movement in Animal Welfare Science Thinking. Now, I should say that there is a much larger collection of slides that will be available on the website, and so you will have access to these, so you can't read these as they are at the moment. But the bottom two are papers that are available with free download for anyone who's interested in looking at the more detailed examination of some of these issues. Just to say that there are many publications in this area from many people around the world. So I'm going to talk about science-based animal care and its problem-solving basis. Then the 5 freedoms, which many of you will be aware of, and their strengths and weaknesses. The 5 domains model, which is a way of assessing animal welfare in different circumstances. Then a replacement for the 5 freedoms in the form of the 5 domains and welfare aims paradigm. Now all of this will become clearer as we go through it. And then the sort of stratification of quality of life that animals may have: lives not worth living, lives worth avoiding, lives worth living, and good lives. And then we'll have some concluding remarks. Okay, so science-based. I hope that's not going to disappear on me. Right, okay. 80 to 100 years ago, we were really ignorant of how to keep animals alive and healthily productive. The approach was primarily traditional, opinion-based and subjective, and there were huge nutritional, environmental and health problems. And interestingly enough, quite a few institutes and university departments were set up to apply science to solving these problems. Decades of problem-focused research have made a huge difference. And generally, there were 3 linked approaches. Identify the problem, find out what the biological function underlying the problem is, and then manipulate the function to solve the problem. Survival and healthy productivity were the aims, not animal welfare. Animal welfare was not an area that was considered scientifically until about, well, at the earliest 30 years ago, and very intensively and increasingly so over the last 20 years. But the advances made in these areas did improve animal welfare. In the nutritional area, for example, we defined life cycle changes in the nutrient requirements of livestock, which as recently for me, as the 1960s were still not understood. Deficiencies and excesses of particular nutrients were identified and remedial actions able to be put in place. And as a result of those and many other developments, the nutritional management of livestock was hugely improved. Environmental issues related to the genetic fit of animals to their environments, and of course the nutrition that I've just talked about, your industry has benefited from that, and certainly in terms of the compatibilities and incompatibilities of animal environment interactions are much better understood, and a huge amount of that went on in Australia, of course, and ways of improving the genetic fit were found. And then in terms of health, 70 vaccines, at least, probably 80 vaccines for animals have been developed over that period, preventing often fatal but also very unpleasant diseases that animals may have. The importance of hygiene was increasingly understood, and the use of antiseptics, analgesics, and anthelmintics, antibiotics, and anesthetics were also developed. Interesting that they're all A's. And surgical techniques were greatly improved. And they're just some of the health developments that have occurred and that are now routinely applied to animals, which are now available as a result of this problem-solving ethos. Now, I should point out that nutrition, environment, and health really relate to the basic survival needs of animals. So, how many people have heard of the 5 freedoms? Quite a few. Okay. I'm going to try to expunge them from your consciousness. Okay. So these will be familiar. Now, I'm not going to read them out because we'll be, in a way, returning to them. But when John Webster in 1993-94 developed the 5 freedoms, he was clear that there were freedoms and there were provisions. The freedoms are more or less the aim. Freedom, for example, freedom from thirst, hunger, and malnutrition, and the provision was by providing ready access to fresh water, etc. Okay? And they were clearly put in these 2 columns. But pretty soon, the 5 freedoms became the freedom from, by providing, as a one statement. And so the notion that there was a distinction between the freedom and the provision was lost. You'll see the importance of that in a moment. Okay, so the strengths of the 5 freedoms when they were developed is that it was a way of considering animal welfare in its management. It was been widely adopted because it scoped the wider dimensions of animal welfare. It specified areas of welfare concern. It identified 5 targets for improvement, the freedoms, and it detailed practical ways to meet these targets, the provisions. So, very rational, and that's why they really caught on. It's also important to note that the 5 freedoms drew attention to the need to understand what the sources of negative welfare states were and to identify and minimize them. And this has been a major focus of animal welfare science research for at least the last 2 decades. Also recall the problem-solving ethos at the time, and you can see why the 5 freedoms caught on, even though there are now some difficulties, being free of these problems. Okay. Our current knowledge, unfortunately, shows that they are conceptually and biologically inaccurate and misleading. So there we go. We've sort of... as ideal or aspirational states, they are impossible to achieve. Thus, the principles, as principles, they are unsound and illogical. And they do not provide a convincing basis for animal welfare assessment and management. Also, expressed as freedoms, they can't be used to grade animal welfare compromise because the meaning of degrees of impaired freedom is obscure and lacks utility. However, if you look at the 5 freedoms, you can see that the categories that are covered by the 5 freedoms are nutrition, environment, and health. Remember, I said they're the survival critical ones, and behavior and mental experiences. The thing that is really helpful about the 5 freedoms, or was helpful, is the provisions, because it is the provisions that have been included in animal welfare codes. So if you look closely at those, you will see that it is the provisions that are stated, not the freedoms, although some welfare codes refer to the 5 freedoms. Our Animal Welfare Act didn't, because I managed to ensure that they didn't mention them. But meeting the physical health and behavioural needs of animals was in there, but without the complicating problems of calling them the 5 freedoms. Now, the 5 domains model was a model I developed with Cam Reed back in 1994, and it was a way of, it related to updating our animal welfare understanding, and in order to give you a background to that, I need to just make a couple of remarks. The first is that animal welfare is a state within an animal. It's not how we look after the animals, it's not animal care, it's not animal husbandry, it's not animal treatment. Those things affect the state within the animal, what the animal experiences. It relates to subjective experiences, emotions, feelings, or the technical psychological word is affects. So affect, A-F-F-E-C-T, is the general term that is often used. The brain structure and function of the animal must be sophisticated enough to support these experiences. And these subjective experiences arise via brain processing of 2 main types. It's not going to get more complicated than this, don't worry. Inputs from within the body that register what's actually the particular states that are going in the body, and I'll be giving you some examples, giving rise to particular experiences that relate very specifically to those states. So they reflect the internal functional state. The other source is external inputs of sensory inputs, eyes, nose, mouth, skin, ears, etc., which contribute to the animal's experience of its external circumstances. Examples of the internally focused ones are breathlessness, thirst, hunger, pain, nausea, dizziness, debility, weakness, and sickness. And you thought it was just distress, didn't you? Now, 3 of those were mentioned in the 5 freedoms, thirst, hunger, and pain. The externally focused negative experiences include anxiety, fear, panic, frustration, anger, helplessness, loneliness, boredom, and depression. The only one mentioned in the freedoms there was fear. So that's quite a long list now compared to what people had been thinking about. And that's an indication of how understanding has improved with scientific investigation. Now, the model is not, the 5 domains model is not a definition of animal welfare. It is a facilitatory device. And its purpose is systematic, structured, and comprehensive assessment of animal welfare. Its initial focus was on the sources, types, and grading of animal welfare compromise, because Cam and I developed it to evaluate the negative impacts of research, teaching, and testing procedures on animals. And it was subsequently applied to other areas. The sources, as I've already mentioned, were internal physical and functional disruptions or imbalances, or external restrictions on behavioural expression or threatening circumstances, and so on. The types of those situations are reflected here. The internal focus, impeded breathing, giving rise to breathlessness, dehydration, to thirst, nutritional shortage, to hunger, injury, to pain, GI infections, gastrointestinal infections, to nausea, other infections, to sickness and weakness. Externally focused experiences, isolation, giving rise to loneliness and depression, threat to anxiety, fear, and panic, barren conditions, boredom, helplessness, frustration, and anger. So you can see, and there is neuroscience support for these particular experiences, not in every animal, but in animals under circumstances such as these. and there is a capacity to grade them on a 5-point scale. We don't have time to go into that. Now, this is the 2009 model, and you can see across the top the 4 physical functional domains, the first 3, nutrition, environment, and health, being the survival critical ones, and the behavioral one being the domain which is used to assess the animal's perception of its external circumstances, the impact of the external circumstances on the animal. Now, I want to be clear. The model is not a facsimile of the body. It is a model that has packaged bits of it that help you to make this comprehensive assessment of animal welfare. And you can see that those particular negative experiences negative situations that are outlined in the first 4 feed into the mental state, 5th domain, which gives rise to the experience the animal is having. And that represents its welfare status. So we also, more recently, have included the assessment and grading of animal welfare enhancement. This involves the same systematic, structured, and comprehensive approach. Animal welfare enhancement relates to experiences of various forms that give rise to various forms of comfort, pleasure, interest, confidence, and a sense of control. Now, what I want to do now is just give you a sense of thinking about the mental domain of what the experiences might be, but what the positive experiences might be in each of the domains. So the positive experiences that contribute to welfare that are aligned with the 5th domain, in the nutritional one, the drinking pleasures of or drinking or quenching pleasures of drinking water, pleasant smells, tastes, and textures of food, of a variety of food, and satiety would fall into that sort of category. Domain 2, environment, auditory, olfactory, visual, thermal, physical, and physical comfort. Also, variety-related comfort, where things aren't absolutely stable, never changing. And then health, the comfort of good health and high functional capacity, and the vitality of physical fitness. And those of you who are not physically fit will remember what it was like, and those of you who are will know what it's like right now. Okay. Now, in terms of behavior, the sorts of behaviors that animals find rewarding, and this has been supported by neuroscience, understanding brain processing, are goal-directed exploration and foraging or hunting. Now, this, bear in mind, this is not just for farm animals. This is for all animals, well, all mammals and birds. And actually, in zoos, they're even applying it to all vertebrates, and I heard that they're looking at tarantulas as well with this sort of, yes, quite. Affectionately bonded. Affectionate sociability. You can't say that animals love each other. You know. Nudge my wife and say, I'm feeling affectionately sociable. Doesn't elicit a particularly good response. Maternally rewarded. Now that's maternally, paternally, or group care of young, but if we're thinking mainly of farm animals, it would be more likely to be maternal. Excited playfulness. Sexually gratified, calmness, in control, feeling safe, exercising choice. These are all known to be associated with positive experiences that animals have. And that can be graded. We're not going to worry about grading here, but the primary indices of those are behavior. It's actually important to understand key interactions between these negative and positive states. And oh dear. Can you see that all right? Can you read that? Okay. Now, if you look across the top, below the words Mellor and Beausoleil, etc., negative to neutral, and then neutral to positive. Okay? In the top area, survival critical negative experiences that relate to internal imbalances or disruptions. Now these are the experiences: breathlessness, thirst, hunger, pain, nausea, dizziness, debility, weakness, sickness. Now these are not always present and not always present together and so on, but it's these experiences that animals can have. Note that they operate in the negative to neutral range. When you minimize them, they don't go positive. If you are focusing on the survival critical stuff and you are doing a great job of minimizing them to a level that still motivates the behaviors that are essential to the behaviors that are essential to survive: breathlessness for breathing, thirst for drinking water, hunger for eating food, pain for avoiding or withdrawing from injury. Minimizing those to a level where they still motivate those essential behaviors only gets you to neutral welfare. It doesn't get you to positive welfare. Now, if we look at the situation-related stuff, which is in the lower level, those that are negative that relate to threatening, barren, restricted, or isolated environments are, as already mentioned, anxiety, fear, panic, helplessness, loneliness, boredom, depression, frustration, and anger. Now that relates to the circumstances of the animals. And you've all heard of environmental enrichment. And if you provide enrichments, you can, in fact, reduce that list, or you can eliminate it, or largely replace it. Because if you provide animals with a safe, stimulus-rich, spacious environment that includes companionship, then the sorts of experiences they can have are being calm, secure, protected, and confident, engaged, interested, in control, affectionately sociable, bonded, rewarded maternally, paternally, and as a group, excitedly playful, and sexually gratified. Now, our objective and our obligation, and something we take really seriously, is minimizing the negative experiences. The survival critical ones, we're doing it with the nutritional, environmental health approaches that we're all familiar with. The threatening environmental ones, the barren, etc., environmental ones, we do by modifying the environment. So, in terms of the situation-related stuff, by providing animals with opportunities to have these positive experiences, we then have, they then can use them. However, if the survival critical experiences are too intense, if they are not managed appropriately to be minimized, that intensity of those experiences will inhibit the animals from using the opportunities to have positive experiences, even if they're there. So we've got two reasons for minimizing negative experiences. One, because we want to do it anyway, because that's the way we get at least neutral welfare. And two, because it enables the animals to take advantage of those opportunities that will give them positive experiences. The notion used to be that if you minimized thirst, hunger, and things like that, you had good welfare. The message here is there are some positive experiences animals can have associated with drinking and eating and things like that, but to get good welfare, we need to have opportunities for animals to engage in rewarding behaviors. Okay, so this is where we look at the 5 provisions welfare aims paradigm. I wish I could have found something as catchy as 5 freedoms, but it captures the point. Key issues. The provisions were more influential than the freedoms as a device for, in terms of practical advice for welfare management. So by looking at the provisions, we're talking about what you do, how you manage the animals. Most negative experiences listed in the 5 freedoms can only be minimized, not eliminated, because they're needed for the animals to stay alive. They're needed to motivate those survival critical behaviors. And the freedoms mostly focused on negative experiences, but now we must also include positive experiences. And I note on this particular thing that I can't seem to count. It was 1, 2, 3 when on the original. Okay, and we've got 3 ones again. So there are 3 steps that have been recommended. Avoid reference to the 5 freedoms to reduce misconceptions and confusion. Emphasize the provisions, but update them to give attention both to negative and positive experiences or states. And align each provision with relevant animal welfare aims that emphasize animals' experiences that are most important for their welfare. So we'll just go through them. The provisions: good nutrition. Provide ready access to fresh water and a diet to maintain full health and vigour. Now that's the same actually as the first provision in the 5 freedoms. Aims: minimise thirst and hunger, and 2, enable eating to be a pleasurable experience. Good environment. Provide shade, shelter or suitable housing, good air quality and comfortable resting areas. Aims: minimise discomfort and exposure and promote thermal, physical and other comforts. You remember I gave you a list of comforts earlier. Good health. Prevent or rapidly diagnose and treat disease, injury and foster good muscle tone, posture and cardiorespiratory function. Aims: minimise breathlessness, nausea, pain and other aversive experiences and promote the pleasures of robustness, vigour, strength and well-coordinated activity, physical activity. Appropriate behaviour. Provide sufficient space, proper facilities, congenial company and appropriately varied conditions. Aims: minimise threats and unpleasant restrictions on behaviour and promote engagement in rewarding activities. And then the 5th, positive mental experiences. Provide safe, congenial and species-appropriate opportunities to have pleasurable experiences. And the aim: promote various forms of comfort, pleasure, interest, confidence and a sense of control. Now you can see that effectively the provisions are just somewhat expanded on the previous ones, and that the welfare aims are an updated version of the 5 freedoms. But they're not the 5 freedoms, they are welfare aims because we don't mention freedoms. Okay, the names of the provisions parallel those of the 5 domains: nutrition, environment, health and behaviour and mental state, which date from 1994 and then progressively updated to last year. And the first 4 names are the same as the 4 European welfare quality principles: good nutrition, good environment, good health and appropriate behaviour. And great minds think alike, and independently, Teresa has actually adopted the same sort of patterning to the background to her animal welfare indicators work. Whoops. Now both of these frameworks, the 5 domains and the welfare quality, note that negative experiences and states must be minimised and positive experiences and states must be promoted. Provision 5 is directed at the now accepted objective of giving greater attention to promoting positive experiences. Okay, so if we think about the key animal care strategies that come from this, in implementing the 5 provisions, we want to minimise internally generated negative experiences, and we want to minimise externally generated negative experiences as well, and or replace them with positive experiences, those last ones. We also want to monitor welfare state using well-validated functional and behavioural indices, and Teresa's going to be talking about that shortly. It's also very important to think about properly trained animal care staff to ensure that they possess good welfare-related knowledge and skills and attitudes towards animals, that they behave empathetically and as appropriate, bond with the animals. Some circumstances you can't, and remember this is the full spectrum of animals, not just farm animals. The ability to recognise when welfare problems arise, and the ability to implement remedies when required, and if necessary, seek advice. So, we've looked at science-based problem solving, 5 freedoms, their pluses and minuses, the 5 domains model as a way of assessing animal welfare in a comprehensive way, the 5 provisions welfare aims paradigm, which is intended to replace the 5 freedoms. Now, it's perfectly possible that someone will come up with modifications to that will make them better, and that's absolutely fine. They're in the public domain, they're there for people to use. And now we're going to think a bit more about quality of life, which talks about the balance between positive and negative experiences. And under that heading, we're going to look at lives not worth living, worth avoiding, worth living, or good lives, just as ways of thinking about the full spectrum of quality of life that animals may have. Making quality of life assessments is difficult, not pretending it isn't. Nevertheless, this progression in those different approaches acknowledge that animal care should be directed at more than mere survival. The survival critical stuff, you're keeping them alive. If you want them to do more, that is to thrive, it needs to be directed at more than just the survival critical areas. Animals can, and given the opportunity, do have positive experiences. An overall positive balance is possible and should be mandatory. Well, you know, it should be aimed for and in the most practical ways possible under the circumstances that you're dealing with. And leading from this is that codes of welfare should therefore be reviewed and should aim to include validated enrichments. Now, I should just make a quick point here. You hold up your hands in horror and say, we can't do all of that straight away. Incremental improvement, folks. There will be some things here that you'll be able to do with relative ease, and the idea is to stimulate thinking about this and for you to think of what that might be. Okay, so there is this scale, if you like, notional quality of life scale, where which I derived from a paper Talia Green and I wrote, but it relies on, or it has relied on, a publication by the Farm Animal Welfare Council and also by James Yates from RSPCA in the UK. So, the top category is a good life where the balance is strongly positive. And you would think of that as being in place when there is full compliance with the best practice recommendations well above the minimum standards. A life worth living is, the balance is still positive, but less so, and full compliance there with minimum standards, but importantly, those minimum standards need to include some significant enrichments at least. Because if you have no enrichments there, you're dealing with neutral to negative states. Then you've got the point of balance, where you have the positive, negative in balance. A life worth avoiding is where the balance is negative, but where veterinary and husbandry treatments can correct the situation. And then a life not worth living is where the balance is strongly positive and where euthanasia would be the management tool to be used. Something's happened. Good. Now, so you've got that. Now, how might you approach that? using some information from Fork and also some questions that Talia and I devised for 2011, there are some questions that you can ask yourself in relation to providing lives worth living, at least. Overall, what opportunities are provided for animals' comfort, pleasure, interest, confidence, and sense of control? More specifically, what provisions have been made to ensure that eating the food provided will be enjoyable? How will expressions of normal behaviour be encouraged and harmless wants met? This means not giving your Labrador absolutely everything it wants to eat, otherwise, otherwise it will end up an adipose mass. What environmental choices will be available that will encourage exploratory and food acquisition activities that are rewarding? And then finally, what provisions have been made to enable social species to engage in bonding and bond-affirming activities, and as appropriate, other affiliative interactions such as maternal, paternal and group care of young, play behaviour and sexual activity? And just as an aside, with regard to paternal care of young, there was people observing wild dogs in Africa where they'd made a kill, and the top dog shouldered his way in like the male lion, and he snarled everyone out of the way and he filled his gut, and as he was walking away, the researchers looking at this turned to each other and said, "There, you see, this male-dominated, just looking after himself to start with, typical male, you know, sort of." You understand the thing? Okay. They followed him, and he went back to the den, sicked it up, and gave it to the female that was back in the den, feeding the pups with her milk. So, not everything is as it seems immediately. Sometimes it is. We won't talk about the American election. Okay. So, some conclusions. I think we're doing all right for time, aren't we? Right, okay. 5 to go. Right. Okay. So, drawing out of this, I would be saying that there's a clear need to update the characterisation of animal welfare to accommodate recent developments in understanding. Animal care needs to aim higher than mere survival via negative to neutral nutritional, environmental and health management. Acceptable animal welfare management should both focus on both minimising of negative experiences and promoting positive ones. Minimum code standards should include greater provision for validated enrichments, and this is beginning to happen. I mean, the cage furniture and larger cages and barn layers and barns and free range have been in initiatives that have been taken, getting sows out of stalls into group housing that isn't just basically a whole lot of sow stalls together with virtually no room as a duplication has been occurring, and there are a whole lot of other things. And I might say that the zoo and aquarium sector is doing absolutely amazing things in this area, and the livestock sector might find it useful to just keep an eye out for the sorts of things they're doing in the zoo and aquarium sector, especially the zoo sector, because it may actually give you some ideas for practical, straightforward and simple things that you can do where you could make a little bit of a difference. And my purpose here has been to stimulate discussion and action. And as a final point, going back to the first thing I said in terms of the bottom line, our understanding of animal welfare is changing, and you've got a taste of where it is going, and it is going in this direction. Societal expectations are changing in this sort of direction as well. Now, that will increase the pressure on the supply chain managers and participants to do what you are already doing. You've got some really good systems in place. and some really good things have been happening. But with this change, you can imagine that if people are increasingly saying, well, you know, we've got to have more positive experiences that these animals have, that will increase that sort of pressure. And the way to go about it, in my opinion, is not to say, we've got to handle this challenge and only do it because there's a challenge. My view is that if you adopt the responsible, ethical position of saying we are managing animals for our purposes and we have an obligation to do the very best we can under the practical circumstances with which we are confronted, then by doing that you will automatically provide the answers to the challenge. But if you're just doing it because you've got a challenge, you are not therefore taking on the ethical responsibility that you have and that we have when we use animals for any purposes, because we're using them for our purposes and not theirs. So, ideas are changing. They will pose a challenge, but it is within your power to demonstrate even more than you have up to now ways of responding to that in an extremely positive way. Thank you.